Whether you operate one forklift or thousands, one location or hundreds, the new My Toyota customer portal can help you optimize your operation and material handling equipment. This one-stop, free-to-use platform is designed to help you take control of your information and make smarter decisions, all at the touch of a button. Register and access your data today at my.toyotaforklift.com. That's my.toyotaforklift.com.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. Now, today's episode, I am going to be joined by Dennis Hoang. He is the COO and co-founder at Patturn, and that's Patturn with a U, as you may be able to see if you're watching on video in Dennis's background. But we're going to talk all about Patturn, how Dennis came up with the idea for Patturn and his background a little bit, and how it's led to kind of simplifying returns and also re-commerce for companies. So very interesting and interested to dive into this and talk all about this world of returns and re-commerce that they've created. So Dennis, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good, Kevin. Thanks for having me on today. I'm super excited to talk about a little bit about what we do here at Patturn.
Definitely. Happy to get you on. Happy to be able to talk about this and learn more about this, especially when we talk about the returns and re-commerce space becoming such a hotter and hotter topic, I would say, as it becomes more and more of a bigger issue, which we'll dive into a little bit. But I guess first, tell us a little bit about kind of your background and how you came to found this company, Patturn.
Yeah, sure. So Patturn honestly had an interesting start. Back in the early 2000s, my parents essentially opened up a small computer repair shop in Fort Worth, Texas. And eventually that business began to grow bigger and bigger to the point where they were partnering with large electronics and computer kind of distributors. But the problem was that they never really had a system in place to help them effectively track costs and the workflows on an item level basis, right? Let's say, for example, a distributor sent them 10 laptops with all varying laptop conditions, right? One might have a broken screen, one might have a broken keyboard, yada, 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 right? They never really had a system to accurately track cost on an item level basis. And they originally developed an internal system, but it never really worked out the way they wanted to. So my parents having a business, historically in Asian culture, the kids also go to work with the parents too. Yeah. Right? On the weekends, I would spend my time here, and during the summers, I would spend my time here. So I was working in the business ever since I was a kid, right? So back in 2019, my brother Davis and I, who's also the CEO, we went to a small returns conference known as Consumer Returns Conference. This is a conference where large retailers and brands get together to discuss anything related to returns and effective strategies for managing their returns. We were on the hunt for, honestly, software to help my parents' company. However, when trying to look for software, it didn't really exist on the market at all. There's no true end-to-end return software. There's only softwares that work on bits and pieces of their returns, but not the full kind of puzzle that we're looking for.
Interesting.
Companies that did develop a end-to-end return software typically kept it internal, and they didn't really offer it to the public. So honestly, after that conference, my brothers and I literally said, hey, let's just try to develop it in-house. And essentially what we did was we wrote out every single problem that we experienced on a daily basis, and we created a software to fully manage that whole process, right? And that's essentially where we came up with this idea of Patturn. Patturn powers our returns and re-commerce business.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting, and I've heard that before, where it's just kind of like bits and pieces that are being addressed, whether it's like on the internal processing side or the external consumer facing side. So, I mean, tell us a little bit about kind of, how, well, I guess first, why don't you tell us, why do you think that traditionally that's been the way, like that there hasn't been that kind of end-to-end solution in the market?
I think simply because there hasn't been a company that has effectively managed all the pieces all together, right? There's only been companies managing the technology side, but the problem with returns is that it's very item focused, right? It's a very item focused industry, and there hasn't been an effective way to manage, the process of opening a box, inspecting it, and then trying to figure out what to do next, right? It's an item level process, and you need a significant amount of manpower plus technology to manage that whole process, right? Just because you don't really control what comes back to you. It just depends on what the customer returns.
Right.
You'll never get 10 of the same laptops or clothes or shoes or whatever category you're processing. It just really depends on what the customer returns, right? And this problem is super prevalent when it comes to big retailers, right? Big retailers just don't have the resources or allocations or softwares in place to effectively manage that.
Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting point too, because you mentioned there, you don't really know what's going to come back or have control of that, right? I mean, when you're shipping things out, you have a little more control. You know a little bit like what's going on, in terms of demand and forecasting and understanding, frequency and maybe batching picks or things together of that nature to make that more efficient. But on the backside, you don't know, which customer is going to decide they want to return, which customer is going to decide they don't want to return.
Exactly. Right. You have the only thing that you really know is your returns rate, right? So on average, 30% of what people buy is being returned, right? That's the average rate across everyone, right? So that could be, it could be anything and everything, right? And with wildly flexible returns rates, right? I think some retailers, I'll just say it, like, for example, Nordstrom lets you return an item in any condition for your lifetime, right? And then Amazon makes it easy to where you can do it you can essentially use an item for 89 days, right? And then return it on day 90 with no questions asked, right? Yeah. So they make returns. Every retailer and every brand makes returns so easy. And it makes sense. They want to keep their customers, right? But on the item side, right, they're still struggling. They're struggling to figure out what to do next.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's, it creates an issue on that processing side, right? Because you do have that situation where it's like, okay, we're making it very easy for the consumer, which makes sense. So we can retain those consumers, give them a good experience with our brand or our company. But then how do we deal with all the other things on the back end of that? So I guess tell us, where does kind of Patturn come into play there, and what exactly it is that you guys do to help make those processes easier and more simplified and I guess less of a challenge?
Yeah, sure. So what we do is the majority of our customers are actually retailers and not so much on the brand side. So what retailers do is they send us, honestly, their returns inventory by the pallet or the truckload. And it's the Patturn team job to sift through that inventory, inspect each item, add a license plate for tracking, and we help them essentially resell it across our marketplaces and channels.
Interesting.
So instead of, let's say, the retailer having to do all of that processing, we handle all the processing, and we also handle the resale and storage of it as well, and forward logistics.
Interesting. So on your end, you're taking in all of the returns from traditionally a retailer, it sounds like, and then you're processing that. But not only are you processing it, but you're also then reselling it as well. Talk to us a little bit about how that works.
Yep. Yeah. So that's kind of what we describe as the resale magic, right? So a big coin term in our industry nowadays is re-commerce, and you see a lot of re-commerce players in the space. But for us, we resell that inventory across a variety of marketplaces. So I can give you, for example, one of the marketplaces that we've created is a website that we describe as Gender, and it's a women's fashion focused, I guess, online website, right? So on average, the returns rate for fashion is still 30%, but the majority of the stuff that's being returned is 85% new, and 15% of it is maybe not in maybe it maybe have a stain or something like that. but the majority of the stuff is brand new, which is nice. Another thing that we use is we use existing marketplaces. Existing marketplaces like eBay and Poshmark are very, very powerful tools that I really don't think a lot of re-commerce players utilize. So for example, on eBay, we became a top 5 seller when it comes to women's fashion and shoes. And on the Poshmark side, we're one of the only return software company in the world that has actually directly partnered with Poshmark to sell on their platform. Right? Just because on Poshmark, it's more of a platform for smaller sellers that kind of want to get rid of their clothes in their closet. But for us, we are able to connect our system directly to their marketplace. So that way we can sell things as fast as we can.
Very interesting. And I love how you're able to leverage these different marketplaces too. And I'm curious though, from like a retailer perspective, right? If they're sending you something, I definitely get like if they're sending you something that maybe is potentially damaged or has a stain or something, as you mentioned, but things that are still new, I'm curious, like why would a retailer want to send something that's new to you to sell through a different marketplace instead of trying to process that and put that back out into their store?
Sure. Right. So that's a great question. And honestly, I really think it's simply because of returns volume. It's just the volume of stuff that they have to go through is simply not manageable. Right. They're more concerned about their forward logistics than worrying about what you describe as the reverse logistics. Right. These returns keep coming in. And a lot of times, like I said, there's a lot. They're using 5,000 different systems to manage each piece, right? And there hasn't been a single company that effectively says, "Hey, let me create an A to Z return software." And I think that's one of the reasons why. And number two is simply just the manpower, right? Depending on the type of return, like repairing a laptop is very different than refurbishing like a jacket. Right. And, your big guys like Amazon, they have millions and millions and millions of SKUs. Right. So what happens to those millions and millions of SKUs when it comes back to the one of the many thousands of Amazon warehouses? They palletize it and they just palletize all their returns and partner with companies like us to just get rid of it just because they just don't have the manpower to effectively manage it.
Very interesting. Yeah. And I think that makes a lot of sense because there is so much variability around it too, as well as we were talking about earlier. So being able to not only, I think, have that manpower, but then also train that manpower on multiple different things. You mentioned, millions of SKUs with Amazon or something like that, can be a challenging thing to do. So I'm curious in that aspect, like for you guys, you're the ones kind of taking on this challenge, I guess, right? And dealing with this variability that these companies don't necessarily want to deal with or don't have the resources to deal with. So talk to us a little bit about kind of your processes and how you go about processing these returns, especially when there's, it sounds like you're maybe receiving pallets full of random things. Like how do you go about that? And how do you ensure that, quality is maintained there and all the processing steps are being standardized and remain the same?
Awesome. Yeah. Great question. So what we found was that in returns, you have to be, I think you really have to be focused on one specific category, right? So for example, we originally built our system with the intent to mainly focus on electronics, but we've actually pivoted from electronics and we've actually focused on fashion, exclusively women's fashion. And I'd say when it comes to processing, the manual part of sifting through pallets is still going to be there, right? But what we did was any products that come into our warehouse, we essentially create an internal or unique profile to where it's as simple as inspecting the item real quick and adding it into our stock. It's as simple as that. You're not going through and creating essentially a unique item every time. We're essentially using existing data that we've built over time, and we're simply adding it into our system. Let's say, for example, one of the retailers that we work with, we receive roughly, let's say 3 to 4 truckloads of women's shoes, maybe let's say a week, right? Over time, we've built a large database of essentially every shoe brand that you can probably think of, right? Some of the biggest shoe brands that we work that we have internally in our system is Skechers, Clarks, New Balance, you name it. We probably have every single model that has probably ever existed so far. And it's as simple as our staff taking that box, inspecting it, checking the size, and then adding it to our system immediately so that way we can sell.
Interesting. Yeah. I was curious about that because there is so much like variability, but I guess when you're doing such volume, like you said, you're able to, get all those styles and collect all that data over time and be able to manage that. I'm curious, like what happens because, one of the challenges around returns, especially in fashion, is that there's seasons and there's trends and styles and things go out of style, or, you get, there's only certain times of the year that you could really, sell bathing suits in certain parts of the country or certain aspects. So how do you guys deal with that where maybe you're potentially getting, a bunch of winter jackets in the middle of the summer or something, or, how do you manage kind of that inventory and, do you kind of hold it or do you do something else with it? I mean, how do you manage that aspect where that inventory runs out of life?
That's honestly a great question. So at the end of the day, it just comes down to inventory strategy, right? So for example, you're going to sell more sandals. You're going to sell more sandals in the summer and you're going to sell more boots in the winter, right? That's just an obvious thing, right?
Yeah.
So what we do is we track everything on an item level basis, right? So anything that isn't selling within some threshold are internal days, right? Let's say an item's been sitting there for over 2 years and it hasn't moved, right? We'll go through, grab the item, and we'll essentially liquidate our internal liquidations, if that makes sense, right? So we'll palletize it and we'll wholesale it just to move it, just because whatever strategies that we try to get to move isn't working. We'll just liquidate it just to make it more space for inventory for the most part.
Very interesting. Yeah. I was curious about that because, that's certainly a challenge. Especially with fashion, as you mentioned, sandals only really going to sell one point a year. Yeah.
But to give you a perspective of our internal analytics, on average, as soon as we add an item into inventory, it has a 60% chance of selling within the first 30 days.
Oh, nice.
And that's how fast we're moving items.
Yeah, that's definitely good. Yeah. I was curious about that because I know that's one of the challenges for like the retailer too, right? Is like how quickly can we process something to try and sell it again? Yeah, but it is right. And the reason why a lot of retailers and brands are working with us is simply because us being very strong on eBay and Poshmark, right? As soon as we add a listing to Poshmark or eBay, I'm telling you, it sells pretty fast, right? And this is more prevalent for larger brands, right? Let's say if a brand is valued at, let's say if a brand is doing 100 million in sales, a year, right? Like obviously they'll sell more on eBay, right? But let's say if they're only doing like 1 million sales in a year, it's just not going to move. So it just really depends. Interesting. Yeah. Very interesting how you're able to leverage those different marketplaces and be able to move that product pretty quickly, which I think, a lot of brands or retailers struggle with a little bit, trying to figure out how to, not only process it to get it back into like sellable inventory quickly, but then, also how to move it within the lifetime of that inventory kind of. So, obviously returns and re-commerce is something that's increasingly becoming a hotter topic, and, returns, the number of returns, it just continues to grow and grow and grow, especially as people, get more comfortable utilizing online ordering and things of that nature. So I'm curious from your perspective, where do you think, this problem of returns is kind of heading in the next couple years? And do you think that it'll come back and maybe, because we talked about, you mentioned in there how easy it is for the consumer to return, right? Which is kind of part of the root cause for the massive amounts of returns that there are. So, do you think that there will be a shift at some point where it might not be as easy to return, to try and like reduce the amount of returns that are coming in, or where do you think that's heading?
I really think it's going to increase, even if, I think I read an article maybe like a couple weeks ago where they said that Amazon's going to start charging for returns right now, like $1 or something like that. I think customers are still going to really leverage that, right? Even if it is $1 to return an item, right? They're still gonna do it. I think the returns rate is going to increase, right? And in terms of re-commerce, right? A lot of brands nowadays are trying to create their own, I guess, quote unquote, personal secondhand website. But from my understanding, it's not really moving inventory the way they want to, right? They'll partner with a re-commerce company, and that re-commerce company will essentially say, hey, let me create a pre-loved or used website for you. But they'll only manage the front end of the website, right? But when it comes to the actual inventory, they just have to do it themselves, right? A lot of times they just don't want to do it themselves. They just want to send it. They want to send out the inventory and get rid of it. So that way it's just more space for them in their warehouse or whatever it might be.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, and I've seen some of those pop up, and I think that it's hard to get those to gain some traction, right? Because you at least with some of the marketplaces that are out there, like you mentioned, the eBay and the Poshmark, right? At least you go on there as a consumer, and there's a little more variety, I guess, if you're kind of like shopping around, and if you're going to like brand specific, like it's probably like slim pickings a little bit, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, and to be honest, like I really don't like, even though these brands have their pre-loved websites or whatever it might be, they have no way to actually navigate to these websites, right? They're not spending any money on leading customers to these pre-loved websites, even though they're building it out.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and it's almost like kind of does the pre-loved compete with like their main shop too,
yeah, exactly, right? And that's exactly what they're concerned with, just because they have a lot of, like I said, 30% of their inventory is going to be competing with the 70% of what they're selling online.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting stuff from you here, Dennis, and definitely interesting to learn about Patturn and how this kind of grew from electronics into fashion now, and being able to address this problem out there around returns and generating these re-commerce platforms and utilizing the marketplaces to get this product that otherwise might sit around in a warehouse somewhere for a while, back out into the market and be able to move that inventory. So really appreciate you coming on and talking to us about this. We can learn all about Patturn. If people are interested in learning more about Patturn and your services, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, sure. If they could just shoot me an email at dennis@patturn.io. I'll typically respond within the first day. Or if you connect with me on LinkedIn, it's just Dennis Hoang. It's just a picture of me, and it should be fairly easy to spot an Asian guy just doing pallet sales. But other than that, those are the easiest ways to connect with me.
All right, great. And we'll definitely put all that information at thenewwarehouse.com so people can easily find it. So Dennis, thank you once again for your time on the show today.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want more content from the New Warehouse, check out our new video series called All Hands on LinkedIn. Just search for the New Warehouse on LinkedIn and follow along.